Muslims love to attack the Apostle Paul, claiming that he corrupted the original teachings of Jesus. But Paul gives us some of the best evidence that there is for Christianity. Practically all scholars today would agree that Paul is the author of Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. Even atheist and agnostic scholars would say that these are reliable historical sources that accurately represent what Paul said and what he did. So Muslims may point to supposed Bible contradictions or other perceived problems, but the historical evidence for the biblical gospel is overwhelming. These 7 books give us everything that historians look for and value. We have eyewitness testimony, multiple independent attestation, enemy attestation, archaeological evidence, and the list goes on and on. The writings of Paul are on solid historical ground, but the typical Muslim avoids these type of historical arguments altogether. Why? Because they know that Paul offers Christianity some of the best evidence available. I'll give you 3 examples. In Galatians 1 and 2, Paul makes sure that he's preaching the same gospel as the other apostles. And he goes to Jerusalem not once, but twice. We're told that 3 years after his Damascus Road experience, he goes up to Jerusalem and he spends 15 days with Peter. The Greek language here indicates that he went there to check out and confirm the historical details. Dr. Gary Habermas compares this word here to eyewitness news. This is what's comparable to it today in our time. But when Paul is there, he gets to meet not only Peter, but James, the Lord's brother. What an incredible time that must have been. But then in Galatians 2, he tells us that he goes back to Jerusalem a second time, 14 years later, to submit the gospel he had been preaching to the apostles once again. And here we're told that those who were of reputation, that is the apostles, contributed nothing to him. And then eventually they give him the right hand of fellowship and they send him on his way. So just so you understand what I'm saying here, Paul meets Peter, James, and John. If we add Paul to this list, we have 4 of the most influential men in the New Testament. These were eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. These were eyewitnesses to his death on the cross. So if Muslims want to accuse Paul of corrupting the New Testament, they have to do more than simply make a claim. The historical evidence from Galatians and several other books is just overwhelming. So, for example, here's another one, 1 Corinthians 15. This chapter contains what scholars believe to be an early creed or tradition that some would say dates to within months of the cross. Others, like the late atheist Gerd Ludemann, says 2 to 3 years, no more than 3 years. So this is incredibly early. Now we have early eyewitness testimony. So this creed speaks explicitly of the Christian gospel. This creed is a doctrinal statement. If you want to know what the early church believed, you look at these creeds that predate the New Testament writings, these early hymns that were meant to edify and build up the church doctrinally. And we could sum them all up with 3 simple words, and that is the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the gospel, the biblical gospel. So again, you might understand why Muslims don't like Paul and they try to undermine his writings. But here's another one. We could also look at Philippians 2, verses 6 through 11. These are known as the Carmen Christi. This is Latin meaning a hymn to Christ. And Paul uses this hymn as a sermon illustration. He's encouraging the church at Philippi to be humble, to exemplify a spirit of humility and selfless love for others, just as Jesus himself did. So unlike many of our contemporary praise and worship songs, this hymn was also meant, again, to edify the church, to build them up. And it gives them some of the best verses that we have really on the nature of Jesus Christ, his deity, and what we would call the hypostatic union. He is fully God and fully man. He is the God man. Verse 6 says that although Christ existed in the form of God, he did not regard equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. So you can see the two natures here. Christ pre-existed in the form of God, but he takes on the form, morphe, of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. He is the God-man, according to this early hymn. And Paul goes on to mention the cross. Of course, he quotes Isaiah 45:23, which is all about Yahweh. But then Paul takes it and applies it to Jesus, saying, one day every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus as Lord. So with just these three passages, we have barely scratched the surface. Overwhelming evidence. There's much more that could be said. But Muslims would have us to believe a book that comes some 600 plus years at best after Jesus. This is according to the standard Islamic narrative. 600 plus years after the first century Jesus walked the earth. If we look at the traditional sayings of Muhammad, or what we would call the Hadith literature, these come even later, some 250 years after the Quran itself. So these authors never met Muhammad, much less Jesus. Why should we accept them as reliable historical sources when we have good early eyewitness testimony that contradicts them? So Muslims may reject Paul, but they simply do not have good reasons for doing so. The gospel Paul preached is on solid historical ground, so much so that even skeptical scholars affirm much of the history associated with the gospel and with the Bible. The gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ. This is the greatest message in the world. So as always, Muslims, we invite you to come to the real Jesus. We invite you to embrace the real gospel. Think about what I've said, will you? So until next time, this is Olin Giles with Radical Truth.